Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a year so brutal that it makes every other disaster look like a minor inconvenience. Picture waking up to find the sun has dimmed to almost nothing, casting the entire world into perpetual twilight. Your crops are dying in what should be the middle of summer. Your stored food is running dangerously low. This isn't fiction. This actually happened in 536 AD, and it lasted for 18 months. So dim the lights and settle in, because we're about to discover why this single year changed the course of human history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey together and explore what made 536 the absolute worst year to be alive. You step outside your home in 536 AD, expecting to see the familiar golden glow of morning sunlight. Instead, you find yourself squinting into a sky that looks more like dusk than dawn. The sun hangs there like a pale ghost of itself, barely visible through what seems like an endless gray veil. This isn't just a cloudy day or a passing storm. This darkness stretches on for weeks, then months. You can look directly at the sun without hurting your eyes, something that should be impossible on any normal day. Across the world, people are experiencing the same terrifying reality. From the bustling markets of Constantinople to the remote villages of Ireland, from the rice fields of China to the olive groves of Italy, the sun has lost its power. Chroniclers in the Mediterranean write about the sun appearing blue and giving off no more light than the moon. In China, historians document how the sun became so dim that it cast no shadows. The Irish describe a year without summer, where snow fell in the middle of what should have been the warmest months. The panic spreads faster than any plague. Farmers watch their crops wither in fields that should be bathed in sunlight. Merchants see their grain stores dwindle as nothing grows properly. Children ask their parents why the world has become so dark, and the adults have no answers. Religious leaders scramble to explain what many believe must be divine punishment for humanity's sins. The truth is, nobody understands what's happening, and that makes everything worse. People who have lived their entire lives following the rhythm of seasons suddenly find themselves in a world where those patterns no longer exist. Summer temperatures drop to what feels like winter. Spring planting fails because the weak sunlight can't warm the soil properly. Even the most experienced farmers, people who have worked the land for decades, watch helplessly as their knowledge becomes useless in this strange new world. The darkness doesn't just block the sun, it blocks hope. Historical records from this period paint a picture of widespread confusion and fear. Byzantine historian Procopius writes that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. John of Ephesus, a Syrian chronicler, describes how the sun became dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months. These aren't poetic descriptions or religious metaphors. These are careful observations from educated people, trying to document something they've never seen before. The psychological impact hits just as hard as the physical effects. You're living in a world where the most basic assumption about how things work has been shattered. The sun is supposed to rise bright and strong each day, bringing warmth and light that makes life possible. When that fails, it shakes people's faith in everything they thought they understood about the natural order. Some communities turn to increased religious devotion, believing they must appease angry gods. Others descend into chaos as social structures break down under the strain. What makes this darkness particularly terrifying is its global reach. This isn't a localized weather event or a regional catastrophe. Reports come in from across Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa describing the same phenomenon. Trade networks that normally bring news and goods from distant lands now carry only stories of darkness and failing crops. The realization slowly dawns that whatever has caused this darkness, it's affecting the entire known world. Scientists studying ice cores and tree rings centuries later would piece together the puzzle of what happened in 536. The evidence points to massive amounts of sulfur dioxide being thrown into the atmosphere, creating a global veil that blocked sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. These sulfate particles acted like tiny mirrors in the sky, reflecting solar radiation back into space before it could warm the planet. The effect was like throwing a blanket over the entire world. The volcanic eruption responsible for this darkness was enormous beyond anything people in 536 could imagine. When a volcano explodes with enough force, it doesn't just affect the local area. It shoots material high into the stratosphere, where winds carry it around the globe. The sulfur dioxide from this eruption mixed with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols that spread across continents. These particles stayed in the atmosphere for months, creating the prolonged dimming effect that terrified people across the world. The location of this catastrophic eruption likely was Iceland, though some evidence points to multiple volcanic events happening around the same time. The Icelandic volcano would have exploded with tremendous force, sending massive quantities of ash and sulfur compounds into the upper atmosphere. Within weeks, these particles would have circled the globe, carried by high-altitude winds that people in 536 had no knowledge of. From their perspective, the darkness simply appeared everywhere at once, as if the sun itself was failing. Temperature records reconstructed from tree rings show that 536 marked the beginning of one of the coldest decades in over 2,000 years. The global average temperature dropped by several degrees, enough to turn what should have been warm growing seasons into extended winters. In some regions, temperatures fell so dramatically that frost occurred in summer months. This wasn't just uncomfortable weather. It was a climate shift that would reshape human civilization. The volcanic winter triggered by this eruption lasted far longer than the immediate darkness. While the sky gradually cleared over the following months, the climate effects continued for years. The particles in the atmosphere continued to reflect sunlight, keeping global temperatures lower than normal. Even after the visible dimming ended, the world remained locked in an unnaturally cold period that would affect food production and human survival for a decade or more. Contemporary accounts describe not just the darkness itself, but the eerie quality of light during this period. The sun appeared more like a dim lantern than the brilliant star people knew. Colors looked washed out and strange. Shadows became weak and indistinct. The world took on a gray, lifeless appearance that matched the growing desperation of its inhabitants. Even when clouds weren't present, the sky had a hazy, unnatural quality that made everything feel wrong. For people living through 536, each day brought new evidence that their world was fundamentally changing. The familiar cycle of day and night continued, but without the life-giving warmth and brightness they depended on. Crops that should have been thriving in summer heat instead struggled to grow in conditions more like late autumn. Animals became confused by the unnatural climate, affecting hunting and livestock management. The darkness wasn't just blocking sunlight. It was unraveling the entire web of relationships between humans and their environment. This global dimming event would prove to be just the beginning of 536's horrors, setting off a chain reaction of environmental disasters that would devastate human populations across continents. Now, when scientists started investigating what could cause such widespread darkness, they kept coming back to one explanation that seemed almost too devastating to believe: a volcanic winter. Not just any ordinary eruption, but something so massive it could change the entire planet's climate in a matter of weeks. Think about the most powerful volcano you've ever heard of, then multiply that destruction by 10. That's what we're dealing with here. A volcanic winter happens when an eruption is so violent that it shoots massive amounts of sulfur dioxide straight up into the stratosphere. We're talking about a column of gas and ash reaching heights of over 20 miles above the Earth's surface. Once that sulfur dioxide gets up there, it mixes with water vapor and creates these tiny particles called sulfate aerosols. These particles act like microscopic mirrors floating in the sky, reflecting sunlight back into space before it can reach the ground. The result? A planet-wide dimming effect that can last for years. The truth is, most volcanic eruptions don't have this kind of global impact. Your typical volcano might affect the local area, maybe the surrounding region if it's particularly large. But what happened in 536 required something extraordinary. The eruption had to be powerful enough to punch through the lower atmosphere and inject material directly into the stratosphere, where high-altitude winds could carry it around the entire world within weeks. Scientists found their smoking gun buried in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. These ice sheets preserve a record of atmospheric conditions going back thousands of years. Each year's snowfall creates a new layer, trapping tiny particles from the atmosphere like a natural time capsule. When researchers examined the layers corresponding to 536A, they found massive spikes in sulfate particles. We're not talking about a slight increase here. The levels were off the charts, indicating volcanic activity on a scale rarely seen in human history. The ice core data tells a story of multiple eruptions happening in quick succession. The first major spike appears around 536, but then you see additional peaks in the following years. This suggests that either one enormous volcano kept exploding repeatedly, or multiple volcanoes erupted within a short time frame. Either scenario would have created a perfect storm of atmospheric disruption that could maintain the darkened skies for months on end. Tree ring evidence backs up what the ice cores revealed. Trees are like natural thermometers and light meters, recording environmental conditions in their growth patterns each year. When scientists examined tree rings from around the world dating to 536 AD, they found something remarkable. The rings from that year and the following years are incredibly narrow, indicating severely stunted growth. Trees from Ireland to China to South America all show the same pattern. This wasn't a regional weather problem. This was global environmental stress. The tree ring data also reveals just how long the effects lasted. While the initial darkness might have cleared after 18 months, the climate remained abnormally cold for nearly a decade. Some trees show reduced growth patterns lasting until the mid-540s, suggesting that the volcanic particles continued to affect sunlight levels and temperatures for years after the initial eruption. Experts who study these ancient climate records describe the 536 eruption as potentially one of the largest in the past 2,000 years. The amount of sulfur dioxide released into the atmosphere would have required an explosion comparable to some of the most devastating volcanic events in recorded history. We're talking about an eruption that released millions of tons of gas and ash into the stratosphere, enough material to create a global atmospheric shield that dimmed sunlight across continents. The scale becomes even more impressive when you consider the technology available in 536. Without satellites or global communication networks, people had no way to understand that they were witnessing a worldwide phenomenon. Each community experienced the darkness in isolation, not knowing that the same terrifying conditions were affecting people thousands of miles away. The eruption was so powerful that it created identical effects from Europe to Asia to the Americas. Pinpointing exactly which volcano caused this disaster has proven challenging. Scientists have identified several potential candidates, with Iceland emerging as the most likely source. The geological evidence points to a massive eruption in the Icelandic volcanic system, possibly involving multiple vents erupting simultaneously. Iceland's position in the North Atlantic would have allowed the high-altitude winds to distribute the volcanic material across both Europe and Asia effectively. Other researchers argue for multiple eruptions happening around the same time. The ice core evidence shows several distinct spikes in sulfate, particles between 536 and 540, suggesting that more than one volcano might have contributed to the climate disaster. This would explain why the effects lasted so long and were so severe across such a wide geographic area. The atmospheric mechanics of the eruption reveal why it had such devastating global effects. When the volcano exploded, it created what scientists call a Plinian column, a massive vertical jet of gas and debris that reached into the stratosphere. At those heights, the material spread horizontally across vast distances, carried by winds that circled the globe. Within weeks, the sulfur compounds had formed a reflective layer that reduced incoming solar radiation by as much as 10% worldwide. The chemical process that created the darkness involved sulfur dioxide combining with water vapor and oxygen in the stratosphere to form sulfuric acid droplets. These droplets clustered into aerosol particles that could remain suspended in the atmosphere for years. Unlike ash, which falls back to Earth relatively quickly, these sulfate aerosols stayed aloft long, enough to create the prolonged dimming effect that characterized 536 and the following years. Temperature reconstructions based on the ice core and tree ring data show that global average temperatures dropped by several degrees almost immediately after the eruption. In some regions, summer temperatures fell to levels typically seen in late autumn or early winter. This dramatic cooling happened so quickly that ecosystems had no time to adapt. Plants that had evolved to thrive in specific temperature ranges suddenly found themselves struggling to survive in conditions they had never experienced before. The eruption also disrupted normal weather patterns across the globe. The reduced solar heating affected atmospheric circulation, changing rainfall patterns and wind systems that communities had depended on for centuries. Some regions that normally received adequate rainfall experienced severe droughts, while others were hit with unexpected flooding as weather systems shifted unpredictably. The immediate aftermath of this volcanic catastrophe set the stage for everything that followed in 536. The dramatic cooling and reduced sunlight created conditions that made agriculture nearly impossible across vast areas of the inhabited world. Crops that might have survived a normal bad weather year had no chance against the prolonged darkness and unseasonable cold. The volcanic winter had fundamentally altered the environment that human civilization depended on, and the consequences would ripple through every aspect of life for years to come. When the volcanic debris settled into the stratosphere, it created something far worse than just a dark sky. The Earth's entire climate system shifted into a prolonged cold period that would last nearly a decade. You're looking at global average temperatures dropping by several degrees almost overnight. That might not sound like much, but when you're talking about the entire planet cooling down simultaneously, even 2 or 3 degrees becomes catastrophic for human survival. The cooling wasn't just a temporary dip in temperature. This was a sustained climate shift that fundamentally changed how the atmosphere worked. The sulfate particles floating in the stratosphere continued reflecting sunlight back into space month after month, keeping the planet locked in an artificial winter. Regions that normally experienced hot summers found themselves dealing with frost in July. Areas that relied on predictable growing seasons watched their agricultural calendars become completely meaningless. Think about what happens to your daily life when the temperature drops unexpectedly. You put on extra clothes, maybe turn up the heat, grab some hot coffee. Now imagine the cold snap lasting for months with no relief in sight, and you have no modern heating systems to rely on. That's what people in 536 were facing, except they also had to worry about growing enough food to survive while the sun barely provided any warmth for their crops. The northern hemisphere got hit the hardest by this cooling event. Ice core data shows temperature drops that were severe enough to affect regions from Ireland to China. Summer temperatures in some areas fell to levels you'd normally see in late autumn. Winter temperatures became brutal beyond anything most communities had prepared for. People who had lived their entire lives in relatively mild climates suddenly found themselves dealing with conditions that would challenge even the most hardy populations. Agricultural systems that had worked for centuries simply collapsed under these new conditions. Crops that needed specific temperature ranges to grow properly couldn't survive in the unnaturally cold environment. Wheat, barley, and other grains that formed the backbone of most diets required warm sunshine and predictable growing seasons. When those conditions disappeared, entire food production systems failed across continents. The cooling also disrupted normal weather patterns in ways that made survival even more difficult. The reduced solar heating affected how air masses moved around the planet. Storm systems changed direction. Rainfall patterns shifted unpredictably. Some regions that normally received adequate precipitation found themselves in severe drought conditions, while others experienced flooding from unusual storm patterns. Communities that had adapted their farming practices to local climate conditions over generations suddenly found their knowledge useless. You have to understand that people in 536 had no scientific framework for understanding what was happening to their climate. They couldn't check weather forecasts or read scientific reports explaining the volcanic winter. From their perspective, the natural order of the world had simply broken down. The reliable cycle of seasons that their ancestors had depended on for thousands of years was no longer working. This created not just physical hardship, but psychological trauma as communities lost faith in their ability to predict and prepare for environmental conditions. The extended cold period created a domino effect that touched every aspect of human life. Livestock struggled to find adequate food as grasslands failed to grow properly in the reduced sunlight. Wild animals that normally provided supplementary protein through hunting became scarce as their own food sources disappeared. Firewood became increasingly precious as communities burned through their winter stores trying to stay warm during unnaturally cold summers. Trade networks that connected distant regions began breaking down as communities focused on local survival rather than long-distance commerce. Ships had difficulty navigating in the strange weather conditions. Overland routes became treacherous as unexpected storms and temperature swings made travel dangerous. The cooling wasn't just affecting local communities. It was disrupting the entire web of economic relationships that held the civilized world together. The decade-long duration of this cooling period meant that even communities that managed to survive the first year faced continued challenges. Just when people thought conditions might be improving, another cold snap would hit. Crops that showed promise early in the growing season would be killed by unexpected frosts. Communities that had carefully rationed their food stores found themselves running out before harvest that never came. Regional variations in the cooling created different types of hardship across the globe. Some areas experienced more severe temperature drops than others. Coastal regions might have been somewhat protected by the moderating influence of large bodies of water, while inland areas faced more extreme temperature swings. Mountain communities found themselves dealing with extended snow cover that lasted well into what should have been the growing season. Each region faced its own unique challenges as the global cooling affected local environments in different ways. The cooling event also changed how diseases spread and affected human populations. Cold, damp conditions created ideal environments for certain types of illnesses to flourish. People weakened by poor nutrition and exposure to unusual cold became more susceptible to infections. Communities that might have been able to maintain their health under normal conditions found themselves facing health crises as their immune systems struggled against the combined stress of malnutrition and exposure. Evidence from ice cores reveals just how dramatic this cooling period was compared to normal climate variations. The sulfate concentrations during this decade were far above anything seen in the previous 1,000 years. Tree ring data from around the world shows consistent patterns of stunted growth that lasted well into the 540s. These scientific records paint a picture of environmental conditions that were truly unprecedented in human experience. The social consequences of this prolonged cooling extended far beyond immediate survival needs. Political systems that depended on agricultural surplus to support armies and bureaucracies found themselves unable to maintain their structures. Trade relationships that had taken generations to establish crumbled as communities turned inward to focus on survival. Cultural practices and festivals that celebrated seasonal changes lost their meaning when seasons no longer followed predictable patterns. Recovery from this cooling event took far longer than the initial period of darkness. Even after the atmospheric particles began clearing and sunlight levels slowly returned to normal, the climate system took years to fully stabilize. Soil that had been frozen for extended periods needed time to recover its fertility. Seed stocks that had been depleted during the crisis years had to be slowly rebuilt. Agricultural knowledge that had been lost during the upheaval had to be rediscovered through trial and error. The global cooling of 536 demonstrated just how vulnerable human civilization was to large-scale environmental changes. Communities that had thrived for centuries found themselves fighting for survival as the fundamental conditions that supported their way of life shifted beyond recognition. This wasn't just a temporary crisis that communities could weather by tightening their belts for a season. This was a fundamental reshaping of the environment that required completely new approaches to survival and social organization. The combination of darkened skies and plummeting temperatures created the perfect recipe for agricultural disaster on a scale nobody had ever witnessed before. Picture your local grocery store completely empty, except this time there are no supply trucks coming to restock the shelves. Ever. That's essentially what happened across the inhabited world as crop after crop failed in fields from Ireland to China. The volcanic winter had turned the entire planet into one massive food desert, and people were about to discover just how quickly civilized society breaks down when stomachs start growling. Wheat fields that should have been golden with summer grain stood brown and withered under the dim sun. Barley crops that communities depended on for bread and beer never grew taller than a few inches before dying in the unnaturally cold soil. Rice paddies in Asia, normally lush and green during growing season, became muddy wastelands where nothing would sprout. The volcanic particles blocking sunlight had created growing conditions so poor that even the hardiest crops couldn't survive. Farmers who had successfully grown food for decades watched helplessly as everything they planted either died immediately or produced yields so small they were practically worthless. The mathematics of starvation are brutally simple. Most communities in 536 had grain stores that could last maybe 6 months if rationed carefully. When crops failed completely across multiple growing seasons, those stores ran out fast. Archaeological evidence from this period shows clear signs of malnutrition in human remains, with bone density changes and growth stunting that indicate severe food shortages lasting for years. Population estimates suggest that some regions lost up to 40% of their inhabitants during this famine period. Communities tried everything they could think of to find alternative food sources. People stripped bark from trees and ground it into flour, creating bread that was barely digestible and provided minimal nutrition. They foraged for roots, nuts, and any edible plants they could find in forests and fields. Normally unthinkable food sources became desperate necessities. Historical accounts describe people eating grass, leather, and even sawdust mixed with whatever grain they could find. The social taboos around what constituted acceptable food disappeared as hunger became the only consideration that mattered. Wild animals became increasingly scarce as the ecological disruption affected the entire food chain. Deer, rabbits, and other game animals faced the same challenges as human communities. Their food sources had also disappeared. making hunting unreliable even for experienced trackers. Fish populations in rivers and lakes declined as the cold temperatures and reduced sunlight affected aquatic ecosystems. Communities that had supplemented their diets with fishing found themselves competing for dwindling resources in waters that produced far less than they had in previous years. The social order that held communities together began cracking under the pressure of constant hunger. Families that had lived peacefully side by side for generations started fighting over scraps of food. Traditional systems of sharing resources during hard times broke down when there simply wasn't enough to share. Leaders who had maintained authority through their ability to provide for their people found their power disappearing, along with the food supplies. The normal rules of property and social behavior became meaningless when survival was at stake. Trade networks that had connected distant regions for centuries collapsed as communities turned inward to focus on their own desperate needs. Merchants who normally transported goods across long distances found nothing to buy or sell. The complex systems of exchange that had allowed specialized production and regional trade disappeared almost overnight. Communities that had relied on importing food from agricultural regions found themselves cut off from their sources of survival. The interconnected world of late antiquity fragmented into isolated pockets of struggling survivors. Children and elderly people suffered disproportionately during this period of extreme scarcity. Young bodies that needed consistent nutrition for proper development were particularly vulnerable to the effects of prolonged malnutrition. Archaeological evidence shows stunted growth patterns and increased infant mortality rates that reflect the severity of the food crisis. Elderly community members, who often possessed valuable knowledge and experience, became burdens that families could barely afford to support. The social fabric that normally protected vulnerable populations unraveled as basic survival became the only priority. The famine created a vicious cycle that made recovery increasingly difficult. Weakened populations couldn't perform the physical labor necessary for agriculture, even when growing conditions began to improve. Seed stocks that communities needed for planting had been consumed during the worst periods of hunger. Draft animals that farmers relied on for plowing and harvesting had either died or been slaughtered for food. The tools and infrastructure of agricultural production deteriorated without maintenance as people focused entirely on finding their next meal. Economic systems that had developed over centuries became completely meaningless during the height of the famine. Money and traditional measures of wealth lost their value when there was nothing to buy. Skilled craftsmen found their abilities worthless in a world where only food production mattered. The complex social hierarchies based on occupation, education, and inherited status collapsed as everyone faced the same fundamental challenge of finding enough calories to survive another day. Religious and political authorities struggled to maintain their influence as their ability to provide practical assistance disappeared. Temples and churches that had served as centers of community support found their resources depleted just like everyone else's. Kings and local rulers discovered that their authority meant nothing to people who were slowly starving. The legitimacy of leadership, traditionally based on the ability to ensure prosperity and security, evaporated when leaders proved powerless against the environmental catastrophe. Women often bore the heaviest burden during this period, as they were typically responsible for food preparation and distribution within families. The impossible task of stretching inadequate supplies to feed entire households fell primarily on their shoulders. They had to make daily decisions about who received what portions, knowing that any choice might mean the difference between life and death for their family members. The psychological trauma of these constant life and death decisions had lasting effects on survivors long after the famine ended. Migration patterns changed dramatically as desperate populations searched for regions that might have better conditions. Entire communities abandoned their ancestral homes, becoming refugees in search of areas where crops might still grow. This mass movement of starving populations created additional problems as established communities found themselves overwhelmed by desperate newcomers competing for already scarce resources. The demographic shifts triggered by the famine reshaped the ethnic and cultural composition of regions across Europe and Asia. The famine's effects extended far beyond immediate hunger, fundamentally weakening the immune systems of entire populations. Prolonged malnutrition made people increasingly susceptible to diseases that their bodies might normally fight off successfully. The combination of poor nutrition, exposure to harsh weather conditions, and the stress of constant survival struggles created perfect conditions for epidemic diseases to spread rapidly through weakened communities. Archaeological sites from this period reveal clear evidence of social breakdown and population decline. Abandoned settlements, interrupted construction projects, and changes in burial practices all point to communities that simply couldn't maintain their normal way of life. The material culture that archaeologists study shows a dramatic reduction in trade goods, luxury items, and evidence of specialized production, indicating that society had been stripped down to its most basic survival functions. The Great Famine of 536 and the following years created conditions that would make populations incredibly vulnerable to whatever disaster struck next. Bodies weakened by years of inadequate nutrition, social systems strained beyond their breaking point, and communities barely hanging on to survival had no reserves left to handle additional challenges. The stage was now perfectly set for the arrival of something that would prove even more devastating than hunger. Just when you thought things couldn't get any worse for the starving populations of 536 and the years that followed, nature decided to throw one more catastrophe at humanity. In 541, a new horror arrived that would make the famine look like a minor inconvenience. The plague had come, and it was about to show the world what real devastation looked like. This wasn't just any disease. This was the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague in human history, and it hit populations that were already hanging on by a thread. You have to imagine what these communities looked like when the plague arrived. People had been surviving on bark bread and grass soup for years. Their bodies were already skeletal from malnutrition. Their immune systems had been beaten down by constant hunger and exposure to harsh weather. Children who should have been growing strong were instead stunted and weak. Adults who had once been capable farmers and craftsmen were now barely able to perform basic daily tasks. These weren't healthy populations that could fight off a serious disease. These were people whose bodies had already been pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. The plague spread with terrifying speed across trade routes that had somehow managed to keep operating despite the ongoing crisis. Ships carrying desperate merchants looking for food also carried rats infected with fleas that harbored the deadly bacteria. Overland caravans that moved between settlements brought more than just news of other struggling communities. They brought death itself, packaged in the form of tiny insects that nobody understood were the real killers. The same networks that had once spread prosperity and culture now became highways for destruction. The symptoms of this plague were unlike anything people had seen before. Victims developed high fevers that left them delirious and unable to care for themselves. Painful swellings called buboes appeared in their armpits, groin, and neck areas, growing to the size of chicken eggs and turning black as they filled with infected blood and pus. These buboes were so painful that even the lightest touch caused excruciating agony. The disease moved through the body with horrifying speed, often killing people within days of the first symptoms appearing. What made this plague particularly terrifying was how it seemed to strike randomly. Healthy family members could go to bed fine and wake up burning with fever. Children playing together in the morning might be dead by evening. There was no pattern that people could understand, no way to predict who would be next. The randomness of death created a psychological terror that was almost as devastating as the physical effects of the disease itself. Communities that had managed to maintain some sense of hope during the famine found themselves consumed by dread as plague victims piled up faster than they could be buried. The mortality rates were absolutely staggering. Modern estimates suggest that some regions lost half their population or more during the worst plague outbreaks. Entire villages simply disappeared, as every resident either died or fled in terror. Cities that had survived the famine by carefully rationing their food stores watched their populations collapse in a matter of months. The plague didn't discriminate based on social class or occupation. Kings died alongside peasants. Priests succumbed just as quickly as the people they tried to comfort. The disease was an equal opportunity destroyer that recognized no human distinctions. In some areas of Europe, Asia, and North Africa, the combination of ongoing famine and plague created death rates that defied belief. Archaeological evidence from this period shows mass burial sites where bodies were thrown together, without the normal rituals and care that communities had traditionally provided for their dead. There simply wasn't time or energy for proper burials when people were dying faster than the survivors could handle. The social structures that normally helped communities cope with death completely broke down under the sheer volume of casualties. The bacteria causing this destruction was Yersinia pestis. Though people in 541 had no understanding of germs or disease transmission, they couldn't see the fleas jumping from rats to humans, carrying the deadly bacteria in their tiny stomachs. They had no way to understand that the same trade networks bringing them desperately needed supplies were also bringing the means of their destruction. From their perspective, death was simply appearing out of nowhere, striking down people who had managed to survive years of starvation, only to die horribly from an invisible enemy. The environmental disasters that had preceded the plague created perfect conditions for the disease to spread and thrive. Weakened immune systems made people far more likely to become infected when exposed to the bacteria. Malnutrition had left entire populations vulnerable to diseases they might have survived under normal circumstances. The disruption of normal social patterns meant that sick people couldn't be properly isolated or cared for, allowing the disease to spread more easily through communities. Changes in rodent populations may have also contributed to the plague's emergence and spread. The altered climate and food shortages affected not just humans, but all animal species. Rats and other rodents that normally lived in stable populations found their own food sources disrupted. This may have caused infected animals to move into closer contact with human settlements as they searched for food. The fleas that carried the plague bacteria jumped from dying rodents to human hosts, creating new infection chains that spread the disease rapidly through communities. The plague hit urban areas particularly hard because of the higher population density and the presence of more rats in city environments. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, became a charnel house as the disease ripped through its crowded neighborhoods. Trade centers that had managed to maintain some commerce during the famine years found their markets empty, as merchants either died or refused to travel to infected areas. The economic activity that had barely survived the agricultural crisis completely collapsed under the impact of massive population loss. Rural communities faced their own unique challenges as the plague spread from infected travelers and traders. Farming villages that had struggled to produce enough food with their weakened populations found themselves losing even more workers to disease. The few people who had managed to maintain some agricultural knowledge died alongside everyone else, taking their expertise with them to the grave. The combination of ongoing environmental stress and massive population loss made any hope of agricultural recovery seem impossible. The psychological impact of watching the plague consume entire communities created trauma that lasted long after the disease had passed through an area. Survivors developed a fatalistic attitude that made them less likely to invest effort in rebuilding their lives or communities. Why plant crops when everyone might be dead by harvest time? Why maintain relationships when death could separate families at any moment? The plague didn't just kill people. It killed hope and the social bonds that held communities together. Healthcare systems that had barely functioned during the famine years completely collapsed under the plague's assault. The few medical practitioners who had survived the food shortages found themselves helpless against the disease they couldn't understand or treat. Traditional remedies that might have helped with other illnesses proved useless against the plague bacteria. Religious healing, which many communities turned to in desperation, offered comfort but no cure. The plague exposed just how little people understood about disease and how powerless they were against a microscopic enemy they couldn't even see. The timing of the plague's arrival made its impact far more devastating than it might have been under normal circumstances. Populations that had spent years fighting starvation had no reserves left to battle a deadly epidemic. Bodies that had been weakened by malnutrition couldn't mount effective immune responses to the bacterial infection. Communities that had already lost many of their leaders and skilled workers during the famine had no experienced personnel left to organize responses to the health crisis. Political and religious authorities who had struggled to maintain legitimacy during the environmental disasters found themselves completely powerless against the plague. No amount of leadership skill or divine authority could stop people from dying in massive numbers. The institutions that had held society together for centuries revealed themselves to be utterly helpless when faced with the combination of environmental collapse and epidemic disease. The stage was now set for the complete breakdown of civilized society as people knew it. When you combine years of starvation with a deadly plague sweeping through weakened populations, something inevitable happens. The careful structures that hold civilization together start cracking like ice on a frozen pond. By 542, daediments that had ruled for centuries were collapsing faster than dominoes. Kings who once commanded armies found themselves ruling over empty palaces. Tax collectors discovered there was nobody left to tax. The bureaucratic systems that kept empires running simply stopped working when half the population was either dead or fleeing for their lives. The immediate consequences hit like a sledgehammer. Administrative centers that had bustled with officials and clerks became ghost towns practically overnight. Court records from this period show an abrupt end to normal government business. Legal proceedings stopped mid-case. Construction projects funded by imperial treasuries were abandoned with tools still lying where workers had dropped them. The complex machinery of governance that had taken generations to build ground to a halt in a matter of months. Regional governors found themselves managing territories that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Villages that had paid taxes and provided soldiers for decades were now empty ruins. The communication networks that allowed central authorities to coordinate across vast distances broke down when there was nobody left to carry messages. Provincial capitals that had served as regional power centers found themselves isolated islands in a sea of abandoned countryside. The Western Roman Empire, already weakened by previous challenges, faced complete administrative breakdown across large portions of Gaul and Britain. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic decline in Roman coins and manufactured goods dating to this period, indicating that the economic system supporting imperial control had collapsed. Towns that had maintained Roman civic structures for centuries reverted to subsistence-level existence or were simply abandoned entirely. In Britain, the collapse was particularly dramatic. Romano-British communities that had maintained their cultural identity for generations found themselves unable to continue organized resistance against Saxon raiders. The plague and famine had so weakened British populations that organized military response became impossible. Saxon settlement patterns show a significant acceleration during this period as they moved into territories that were no longer defended by coherent British forces. The Byzantine Empire, despite being more centrally organized, faced similar challenges in its outlying provinces. Italy, recently reconquered from the Ostrogoths, experienced a demographic catastrophe that made Byzantine control nearly meaningless. Cities like Rome itself saw their populations shrink to tiny fractions of their former size. The imperial administration that had worked to restore Roman rule found itself governing empty territories that generated no revenue and required constant military support to maintain even nominal control. Mass migrations became the defining characteristic of this period as desperate populations searched for regions that might offer better survival prospects. Archaeological evidence shows abandoned settlements across Europe being left precisely during these years. Grave goods and pottery styles reveal population movements on a scale not seen since the barbarian migrations of previous centuries. Entire ethnic groups relocated hundreds of miles from their traditional territories as they fled areas devastated by the environmental disasters. The Slavic expansion into the Balkans accelerated dramatically during this period. Byzantine frontier defenses that had held for generations crumbled as plague and famine devastated the military units responsible for border control. Slavic tribes moved into territories that had been depopulated by disease and abandonment. This wasn't conquest in the traditional sense. These were migrations into empty lands that nobody was left to defend. Germanic tribes that had settled in former Roman territories found their own populations decimated, but still faced pressure from other groups moving westward. The Lombards, who would later invade Italy, used this period of chaos to consolidate their position and prepare for expansion into territories weakened by demographic collapse. The complex balance of power that had stabilized after the fall of the Western Roman Empire completely shifted as population losses reshaped the political landscape. Urban centers suffered particularly severe collapse during this period. Cities required complex support systems to maintain their populations. They needed food imported from surrounding rural areas, trade networks to bring in manufactured goods, and administrative systems to coordinate services. When rural populations collapsed, cities lost their food supplies. When trade networks broke down, they lost access to essential goods. When administrative systems failed, they lost the coordination necessary to maintain basic services like water distribution and waste management. Constantinople itself, despite being the capital of the surviving Eastern Roman Empire, experienced population losses that fundamentally changed its character. The city that had rivaled Rome in its glory days became a shadow of its former self. Archaeological evidence shows entire neighborhoods being abandoned during this period. The complex urban infrastructure that had supported hundreds of thousands of residents was no longer needed for the much smaller population that remained. Economic collapse accompanied political breakdown as monetary systems lost their meaning in regions where basic survival had become the only priority. Coins from this period become increasingly rare in archaeological contexts, suggesting that market-based exchange systems had given way to subsistence production and barter. The specialized production that had characterized late Roman economic life disappeared as communities focused entirely on producing their own food and basic necessities. Professional armies that had maintained imperial control dissolved when there was no longer a tax base to support them. Soldiers who hadn't been paid in months or years deserted to return to their families or died alongside everyone else. Military equipment was abandoned or repurposed for civilian survival needs. The professional military traditions that had maintained Roman power for centuries simply ended in many regions as the social system supporting them collapsed. Knowledge preservation became impossible as the educated classes that maintained literacy and scholarly traditions were decimated alongside everyone else. Monasteries and schools that had served as centers of learning found their communities scattered or dead. Libraries were abandoned as there was nobody left to maintain them. The transmission of cultural knowledge that had continued through previous crises was severely disrupted as the people responsible for preserving and teaching that knowledge simply disappeared. Regional power structures emerged to fill the vacuum left by imperial collapse, but these were fundamentally different from the sophisticated administrative systems they replaced. Local strongmen who could provide basic security attracted followers, but their authority was based on immediate survival needs rather than complex legal or traditional legitimacy. These emerging power structures were simpler, more direct, and focused on immediate practical needs rather than abstract concepts of governance. The demographic changes triggered by this period had consequences that lasted for centuries. Regions that had been densely populated for generations remained sparsely settled for decades afterward. The ethnic composition of entire areas changed as original populations died out and were replaced by migrants from other regions. Cultural traditions that had been maintained for centuries disappeared when the communities that practiced them no longer existed. Archaeological evidence reveals the scale of abandonment that characterized this period. Settlement patterns show a dramatic shift from nucleated villages and towns to scattered farmsteads, as people reverted to subsistence agriculture. The material culture becomes simpler and more focused on basic survival needs. Luxury goods and specialized crafts virtually disappear from the archaeological record in many regions. This breakdown of organized society created the conditions for completely new cultural interpretations of what was happening to the world. When governments couldn't provide explanations or solutions, people turned to other sources of understanding to make sense of their transformed reality. When governments collapsed and rational explanations failed, people did what humans have always done when faced with the incomprehensible. They turned to the gods for answers. Across the known world, communities that had watched their carefully ordered lives dissolve into chaos began creating stories to explain why the sun had abandoned them. These weren't just casual beliefs or passing superstitions. These were desperate attempts by terrified populations to find meaning in events that seemed to defy all natural law. In Constantinople, Christian chroniclers wrote frantically about divine punishment for humanity's sins. They pointed to the darkness as proof that God was angry with the world's wickedness. Church attendance skyrocketed as people packed into basilicas, praying for forgiveness and begging for the return of normal sunlight. Bishops who had previously focused on theological debates suddenly found themselves trying to explain why an all-loving God would plunge the world into perpetual twilight. Their sermons took on an apocalyptic tone as they struggled to interpret events through biblical prophecy. The Byzantine court itself became consumed with religious explanations for the crisis. Emperor Justinian, who had spent his reign trying to restore Roman glory, suddenly found himself presiding over what many believed was the end of the world. Court historians began reinterpreting recent military victories and building projects as signs that had somehow angered divine powers. The emperor's own Christian faith led him to fund massive prayer campaigns and church construction projects, hoping to appease whatever celestial forces had brought darkness to his empire. In the Celtic regions of Ireland and Britain, the darkness triggered a revival of older mythological frameworks that Christianity hadn't completely displaced. Druids and traditional storytellers began weaving tales about cosmic battles between light and shadow. They spoke of ancient gods awakening from long slumbers to wage war in the heavens. The prolonged twilight became evidence of a supernatural conflict that mortals could only endure, not influence. These stories provided comfort to populations that felt powerless against forces beyond their understanding. Irish monks, trying to reconcile their Christian faith with traditional Celtic beliefs, created hybrid explanations that combined biblical prophecy with older mythologies. They wrote about angels and demons fighting in the sky, with the darkness representing the temporary victory of evil forces. These interpretations allowed communities to maintain both their Christian identity and their connection to ancestral beliefs about supernatural battles affecting the natural world. The Germanic tribes scattered across former Roman territories developed their own explanations rooted in Norse and Germanic mythology. They interpreted the darkness as evidence of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods that would precede the end of the current world. This interpretation actually provided some hope, since their mythology promised that a new, better world would emerge after the destruction of the old one. Warriors who had previously focused on earthly glory began preparing for cosmic battles that would determine the fate of existence itself. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements shows increased production of religious artifacts and ceremonial weapons during this period. Burial practices changed to reflect beliefs about preparing for supernatural warfare. Communities that had been gradually adopting Christian practices suddenly returned to older traditions, involving sacrifice and ritual combat. The environmental crisis had triggered a revival of pre-Christian religious practices that many thought had been permanently displaced. In the eastern regions still connected to trade networks, Zoroastrian communities interpreted the darkness through their existing beliefs about eternal struggle between light and darkness. For them, the dim sun represented a temporary victory by Ahriman, the destructive spirit of darkness, over Ahura Mazda, the creative spirit of light. This framework allowed them to understand the crisis as part of an eternal cosmic battle rather than as divine punishment for human failings. Buddhist monasteries in regions affected by the climate disaster began teaching that the environmental collapse was evidence of the world's impermanence and suffering. Monks who had previously focused on individual enlightenment suddenly found themselves counseling entire communities about accepting the inevitability of change and loss. The darkness became a teaching tool for Buddhist concepts about the temporary nature of all worldly conditions. Chinese administrators, trained in Confucian traditions that emphasized harmony between heaven and earth, struggled to interpret events that seemed to represent complete cosmic disorder. Imperial court astronomers worked desperately to find celestial explanations for the prolonged darkness. They created elaborate theories about dragon battles in the heavens and disruptions in the natural order that reflected earthly political failures. The mandate of heaven concept, which justified imperial rule based on cosmic approval, faced serious challenges when the heavens appeared to have turned against humanity entirely. Court philosophers had to develop new interpretations that allowed imperial authority to survive even during periods of apparent divine displeasure. These theological discussions had practical political consequences as regional governors questioned whether continued loyalty to the imperial system was religiously justified. Local folk traditions across all regions began incorporating the darkness into existing collections of stories and legends. Grandparents who had previously told children stories about normal seasonal changes suddenly found themselves creating new tales about years when winter refused to end. These stories often featured heroes who journeyed to distant lands or performed great sacrifices to convince the sun to return to its normal brightness. Artistic expressions from this period reflect the profound psychological impact of living through environmental collapse. Pottery designs become simpler and darker. Metalwork shows influences from religious symbolism rather than purely decorative motifs. Even practical items like tools and household goods begin showing religious symbols as craftsmen try to infuse everyday objects with protective spiritual power. The crisis also triggered changes in marriage and family customs as communities tried to ensure survival of their cultural traditions. Wedding ceremonies began incorporating new rituals designed to ensure fertility and prosperity despite the hostile environment. Naming practices changed to reflect hopes for divine protection. Children born during the darkest years received names associated with light, strength, and divine favor. Religious festivals and seasonal celebrations had to be completely reimagined when the normal cycle of seasons no longer functioned. Communities that had celebrated harvest festivals found themselves creating new rituals focused on survival and endurance rather than abundance. Traditional timing of religious observances, became meaningless when summer felt like winter and growing seasons disappeared entirely. These cultural responses created lasting changes in how European and Asian societies understood the relationship between natural disasters and divine will. The stories and beliefs developed during 536 influenced religious thinking for centuries afterward. Medieval Christianity retained strong apocalyptic elements that traced back to this period of environmental collapse. Folk traditions preserved memories of the Great Darkness in stories that were still being told generations later. The interpretations created during this crisis also established patterns for how later societies would respond to natural disasters. The tendency to seek religious explanations for environmental catastrophes, the revival of older beliefs during times of crisis, and the creation of new myths to explain unprecedented events all became recurring themes in human responses to natural disasters. The cultural memory of 536 influenced how later generations understood the relationship between human behavior and environmental consequences. These ancient responses to environmental collapse reveal patterns that remain remarkably familiar even in our modern world, where scientific understanding provides explanations that people in 536 could never have imagined. The scary truth is, something like 536 could absolutely happen again, and we might be even less prepared than those ancient communities were. Think about it. We've built our entire modern civilization on the assumption that basic systems will keep working. Your grocery store gets restocked every few days. Your electricity stays on. Your internet keeps running. Your government keeps functioning. But what happens when a massive volcanic eruption throws enough debris into the atmosphere to block sunlight for months? All those assumptions disappear pretty quickly. Mount Tambora proved this point back in 1815, when it exploded in Indonesia and created what people called the year without a summer. The eruption sent so much sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that global temperatures dropped dramatically. Crops failed across Europe and North America. People in New England experienced frost in July. Snow fell during summer months. Famine struck regions that normally produced surplus food. The death toll from starvation and disease reached into the hundreds of thousands. And that was just from one volcano that was smaller than whatever caused the 536 disaster. The truth is, Tambora gives us a preview of what a larger eruption could do to our modern world. Back in 1815, most people still lived on farms and knew how to grow their own food. Today, less than 2% of Americans work in agriculture. Most people have no idea how to grow anything edible. When the grocery stores empty out after just a few days of disrupted supply chains, where exactly do you think people are going to find food? Your local Walmart isn't going to magically restock itself when volcanic ash is blocking cargo planes and disrupting shipping networks across the globe. Modern volcanoes are being watched more carefully than ever before, but that doesn't mean we can predict when the next big one will blow. Scientists use seismic monitoring, gas emission measurements, and satellite imaging to track volcanic activity. They can often tell when a volcano is becoming more active. But predicting the exact timing and scale of eruptions remains incredibly difficult. Mount St. Helens gave plenty of warning before it erupted in 1980, but other volcanoes have exploded with little advance notice. The Yellowstone supervolcano sits under one of America's most popular national parks. Monitoring equipment scattered across the entire region, and scientists still can't tell you when it might next erupt. The global supply chains that make modern life possible also make us incredibly vulnerable to climate disruptions. Your smartphone contains materials from dozens of countries. Your food travels thousands of miles before reaching your plate. Your clothes are made in factories on the other side of the world. When a major volcanic eruption disrupts global climate patterns, it doesn't just affect the area around the volcano. It affects crop production in agricultural regions worldwide. It disrupts shipping routes. It interferes with manufacturing processes that depend on stable environmental conditions. Consider what would happen if a 536 scale eruption occurred today. Modern agriculture relies heavily on predictable weather patterns and specific temperature ranges. Genetically modified crops that produce higher yields are often less resilient to environmental stress than older varieties. Monoculture farming means that entire regions depend on single crop types that might fail completely under changed climate conditions. The fertilizers and pesticides that make industrial agriculture possible require complex manufacturing and distribution networks that could be disrupted by global climate shifts. Our interconnected financial systems would face catastrophic stress during a prolonged climate disaster. Stock markets would crash as investors realized that agricultural production and manufacturing were facing years of disruption. Currency values would fluctuate wildly as countries struggled to maintain economic stability. International trade agreements would become meaningless when countries couldn't produce enough food to feed their own populations. The complex web of debt and credit that supports modern economies would collapse under the strain of widespread economic disruption. Modern urban populations are particularly vulnerable because cities concentrate millions of people in areas that produce no food and depend entirely on external supply networks. New York City has maybe 3 days' worth of food in its grocery stores at any given time. Los Angeles imports almost all of its water from distant sources. These cities work fine under normal conditions, but they become death traps when supply networks fail. During a prolonged climate crisis, urban areas would empty out as people desperately searched for regions where they might be able to survive. The positive news is that modern science gives us tools that people in 536 never had. Climate models can predict how volcanic aerosols will spread through the atmosphere. Agricultural research has developed crop varieties that can survive in challenging conditions. Communication networks allow for coordination of disaster responses across vast distances. Medical knowledge means we understand how diseases spread and how to prevent epidemics. International organizations exist to coordinate humanitarian assistance during global crises. But science alone won't save us if we don't use it properly. Early warning systems only work if governments are willing to act on the warnings. Agricultural research is useless if farmers can't access improved seed varieties. Communication networks fail when the infrastructure supporting them gets overwhelmed or damaged. Medical knowledge becomes irrelevant when healthcare systems collapse under the strain of treating massive numbers of patients. International cooperation disappears when countries turn inward to focus on their own survival. The lesson from 536 is that cascading disasters create problems that are much worse than the sum of their individual parts. A volcanic eruption by itself is bad. Global cooling by itself is manageable. Crop failures by themselves can be survived. Disease outbreaks by themselves can be controlled. But when all these disasters hit simultaneously, they create a perfect storm that overwhelms any society's ability to cope. Each problem makes the others worse, creating a downward spiral that becomes almost impossible to escape. Modern preparedness efforts focus on building resilience rather than just predicting disasters. This means diversifying food production so that crop failures in one region don't cause global famine. It means developing communication systems that can function even when normal infrastructure fails. It means training communities to be self-sufficient during emergencies rather than depending entirely on external assistance. It means stockpiling essential supplies and maintaining seed banks that preserve genetic diversity in crops. The reality is that our modern world is probably more vulnerable to a 536 style disaster than the ancient world was. People back then lived closer to subsistence level, so they had skills and knowledge that helped them survive when normal systems failed. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, and lived in small communities where everyone knew their neighbors. Modern people have gained incredible technological capabilities, but we've lost the basic survival skills that got our ancestors through the worst catastrophes in human history. Climate scientists who study past eruptions emphasize that the question isn't whether another major volcanic event will happen, but when it will occur and how prepared we'll be when it does. The geological record shows that massive eruptions happen regularly on timescales that seem long to humans but are brief in Earth's history. The Yellowstone supervolcano erupts approximately every 600,000 years, and it's been about 640,000 years since its last major eruption. Other volcanic systems around the world operate on similar cycles that make large eruptions inevitable over long time periods. Understanding what happened in 536 helps us recognize that environmental disasters, social collapse, disease outbreaks, and cultural upheaval are all connected parts of a single, catastrophic process that could unfold again under the right circumstances. So there you have it. 536 wasn't just a bad year. It was a perfect storm where one disaster triggered the next in an endless chain of destruction. A volcanic eruption led to global cooling. Cooling caused famine. Famine weakened people for plague. Plague collapsed governments. Each piece fell exactly when populations were least able to handle it. The truth is, our civilizations are far more fragile than we like to admit. Remove sunlight for 18 months and watch everything we've built crumble faster than you'd think possible. But somehow, people survived this nightmare and rebuilt their world from nothing.